This is Unit 8, Aquatic and Terrestrial Pollution. Water pollution is the contamination of streams, rivers, lakes, oceans, or groundwater with substances produced through human activities that negatively affect organisms. Water pollution has the potential to impact both aquatic and terrestrial organisms. Leading causes of water pollution come from agricultural, industrial, and mining activities. Point sources are distinct locations. Example, a particular factory pumps its waste into a nearby stream or a sewage treatment plant that discharges its water from a pipe into the ocean. It's easy to trace back to one source. You can point to that source. Non-point sources are more diffuse. Example, an entire farming region where there's runoff from manure on fields after a rain, or a suburban community with many lawns and septic systems. Maybe septic systems leak, or there's excess fertilizer on lawns that runs off, or stormwater running off from parking lots that contains oil and other pollutants. Non-point source pollution is more difficult to control. Pollution is a negative externality because of the cost of the environment is not reflected in the cost of making the products that generate that pollution. This is a case study of the Nyuse River in North Carolina, and you can see the cell, the protist, and it was termed the cell from hell because, as you can see, it used to eat sores, eat its way into fish, and it would also release a neurotoxin that would make the fish behave erratically. They would jump out of the water. And then it turned out that it was causing sores in people that swam in that river, and it was causing them to have neurological issues like memory loss, things like that, cognitive problems. And it all was traced back to manure leaking from manure ponds on a pig farm, large industrial pig farm, that was full of nitrogen that was feeding these protists and causing their population to grow out of control. And this table is just a table of major water pollutants and their sources. It would probably be a good idea to have your students, give your students a copy or have your students copy this down. Human wastewater is water produced obviously by human activities. It can include human sewage from toilets or gray water from bathing and washing clothes and dishes. Oxygen-demanding wastes are organic matter that enters a body of water and feeds the growth of the microbes that are decomposers, and as they decompose, they use up oxygen. BOD, or biological oxygen demand, is the amount of oxygen a quantity of water uses over a period of time at a specific temperature. A low BOD means it's good. That's less polluted by wastewater. A high BOD is not good. That means more wastewater pollution. When microbes decompose and they use up available oxygen, they leave very little for other organisms. An oxygen sag curve is obtained when the concentration of dissolved oxygen in a river into which sewage or some other pollutant has been discharged is plotted against the distance downstream from the sewage outlet. So obviously where the pollution is most concentrated, you're going to see the highest BOD, so you're going to have a sag of oxygen available to living things, and mainly the living things that you do find there are very pollution tolerant, low oxygen organisms like bloodworms and mosquito larvae and things like that. Dead zones are areas where there is little oxygen in the water, so little life can survive there. It tends to be a positive feedback loop because as things die, that's more food for decomposers, so there's more oxygen used. The largest dead zone that occurs in North America is right around the Gulf of Mexico, you can see on this slide. And it's because all of the runoff that collects in the Mississippi River Basin watershed, it ends up in the Mississippi River and it lets out in the Mississippi Delta, right there where Louisiana and Mississippi meet, and every spring there's a huge zone of oxygen depletion, or an anoxic zone, and it causes huge fish die-offs. Solid waste consists of discarded materials from households and industries that do not pose a toxic hazard to organisms. The Great Pacific Garbage Patch was discovered in the North Pacific Gyre in 1997. It's mostly plastic. It's about the size of Texas. And if you click the picture of the albatross, it's a hyperlink to a movie trailer of an island or a key, I guess, rather, that's in this garbage patch. And humans don't live there, only albatrosses. And this photographer went there, and he continuously finds albatrosses just full of plastic that they pick up when they're fishing in the ocean, and also their offspring, because they bring food back to them, and it's full of plastic. Garbage dumping in the ocean was curtailed in the U.S. in the 70s and 80s after medical waste started washing up on beaches, and it was discovered that many plastics were strangling and suffocating sea life. Coal ash and slag are classified as special wastes that can be dumped into landfills, ponds, or abandoned mines, and unfortunately it can contaminate groundwater. Sediments are particulate particles of sand, silt, and clay carried by moving water in streams and rivers that settle out when the water slows down. So you can see here when it gets to the bay and you're at the mouth of the river, that's when it's all going to empty out. So this is natural, and this is what used to make deltas, floodplains, very rich for farming. Human activities substantially increase the amount of sediment that enters waterways, specifically construction, agriculture, ranching. You can see a whole host of activities here. This slide continues with all the different activities that humans do, and then how it either prevents deposition or increases deposition of sediments. So what does that mean, increased sedimentation? Well, it means increased turbidity, which means infiltration of sunlight is reduced, which means primary productivity goes down. Fish gills get clogged and they can't breathe. It can clog filter feeders that are bottom dwellers when it settles out on them. It can also bring increased nutrients, which could cause algal blooms, which we know then leads to huge fish die-offs because of the large amount of decomposers that populate the area once the algae start to die. Heavy metals and other substances pose serious threats to human health and the environment. Lead is a heavy metal that is rarely found in drinking water. It usually gets into water when the water passes through pipes of older homes that are lead. Fetuses and infants are most sensitive. It can cause central nervous system damage and also kidney damage. Federal guidelines have required installation of lead-free pipes for about the last 30 years. Arsenic occurs naturally in the Earth's crust and can dissolve in groundwater and drinking water from rocks. Mining and industrial use of arsenic can contribute also to this. It can be removed via fine membrane filtration, distillation, and reverse osmosis. The highest concentrations are in the Midwest and the western U.S. It is associated with cancers of the skin, lungs, kidneys, and bladder. These pictures are from people in Bangladesh, where they drill very deep wells, and they were contaminated by naturally occurring arsenic, which you can see caused these sores on the feet and hands, and even caused digits to fall off. So bacteria that live in wetlands and lakes convert mercury through the methylation process into a chemical form that is highly toxic to other living things. And it becomes an organometallic cation. You can see it here, the mercury ion with the methyl group attached to it. It has a very high affinity for the amino acid cysteine, and hence proteins that contain cysteine, and it forms a covalent bond where it damages the central nervous system and can cause impairment of coordination and senses, and it is especially harmful to fetuses, infants, and young children. This slide shows victims of Minamata disease. We've got adults, children, and even a picture of a cat. Methyl mercury poisoning was basically being dumped into Minamata Bay. in Japan, and this company didn't tell anybody. So, of course, the unborn were affected most severely, leading to miscarriages and stillbirths. But you can see here a list of things that it caused, like heart disease, autoimmune effects. You can see, and these were characteristics: the curling of the hands, blindness was also common. Dietary sources mostly come through eating fish and shellfish. This methylmercury is formed in aquatic systems and not readily eliminated from organisms. It becomes biomagnified in aquatic food chains. And then the concentration of methylmercury in the top level aquatic predators can reach a level 1,000,000 times higher than the level in the water. Half-life of methylmercury is about 72 days in aquatic organisms, which results in its bioaccumulation within aquatic food chains. It has been related to diminished reproductive success of both fish, fish-eating birds, and mammals. Acid deposition and acid mine drainage. So burning coal, we know, releases SOx and NOx into the air. And then when it rains, it can come back down as wet acid deposition in rain or snow, dry acid deposition in gases that attach to plants and soil. Very tall smokestacks keep the pollutants away from populations but release them into the atmosphere, where they get carried somewhere else, and then they do combine with water vapor to form acids. So anything with a pH below 5 is considered lethal to most aquatic organisms. Coal scrubbers pass hot gases through a limestone mixture in the smokestack, and that removes some of them from the hot gases, some of those SOx and NOx, before they make it out into the atmosphere. Acid mine drainage occurs when an abandoned mine floods with groundwater. The combination of pyrite air and water produces iron and hydrogen ions, and so it's these hydrogen ions that lower the pH of the water emerging from these abandoned mines, which then causes other harmful metals to precipitate out, such as zinc, copper, aluminum, manganese, and lead. It could be possible to pass this water through limestone, which would raise the pH and remove the metals. Many of these mines become abandoned because the companies are no longer in business, and so there's nobody responsible left for the cleanup of the mines or the maintenance of them. Oil pollution can have catastrophic environmental impacts. Petroleum products are toxic to all marine organisms, from the largest to the microscopic. Oil is persistent and can spread below and across the surface of the water. Oil leaves a thick, viscous covering on shorelines that is extremely difficult to remove. One source of oil in water comes from offshore drilling platforms that leak, but the largest source of ocean pollution actually comes from urban and industrial runoff from land, because eventually it ends up in creeks and streams, which lead to rivers, and then rivers lead to ocean, and so ultimately it ends up in the ocean. The 2010 explosion of the Deepwater Horizon platform broke a pipe 1 mile below the surface that spewed for 5 months. So there was an estimated 206 million gallons of oil that were released into the Gulf of Mexico from this disaster. The accident sank the rig and killed 11 of the crew members. The ruptured wellhead was very hard to cap, being a mile down, and you can see some of these pictures, like a picture of a sea fan before and after, a pelican covered with oil, and unfortunately the oil did make it into sensitive wetland areas. It disrupted the livelihoods of the people that lived in the area as well, and caused huge economic losses for Gulf's tourism business. In 1989, the Exxon Valdez ran aground off the coast of Alaska and released 11 million gallons of oil into the ocean and the coastline. Hundreds of thousands of animals were killed as a result. Cleanup efforts took 20 years, and the oil still remains in the shoreline environment. It is still there today. The Oil Pollution Act of 1990 was passed as a result of this accident, and it requires that oil tankers be double-hulled in case of puncture on the external hull. Now, there are natural releases of oil from seeps in the bottom of the ocean, and they do account for about 60% of the oil in waters surrounding North America and about 45% worldwide. Ways to remediate oil pollution. Oil spilled in the ocean can either float on the surface or remain far below in underwater plumes. There's no agreed-upon method for removing those underwater plumes. If the oil is on the surface, it can be contained by laying out plastic floating barriers, and then boats equipped with giant oil vacuums can suck it up. Also, absorbent materials could be used in shallow areas and along coastlines to absorb it. Oil on the surface can also be broken up and dispersed by applying chemicals. Unfortunately, some of these dispersants are toxic to marine life, and it doesn't clean up the oil. It just makes it disperse over a larger area so we don't see it. Some bacteria eat oil from seeps. Geneticists are engineering bacteria to consume oil spills from these natural oil eaters. There is some controversy over this because we're not real sure, obviously, what introducing a new genetically modified organism into a natural ecosystem could eventually do. Ways to physically remediate oil pollution on rocky coastlines is to use high water pressure hoses. You can also see this large scrubber vacuum that's used to clean it, but it's really hard to get in between all those small nooks and crannies. And it's especially hard to clean up in sandy soils where it just seeps straight down. Eutrophication is when nutrients are released from wastewater decomposition and they make the water more fertile. Nitrogen and phosphorus tend to be limiting factors for producer growth in aquatic ecosystems, but soaps and detergents are full of them. So when we flush these things down the drain or throw them out in the trash, if they leak, that's where they eventually end up. Cultural eutrophication is when a body of water experiences an increase in fertility due to humans inputting these nutrients. Again, like the runoff we talked about in non-point source pollution from agricultural lands, wastewater, etc. So again, it causes algal blooms, which then when the algae start to die, that increases decomposer bacteria. They use up oxygen, and as you can see here from this picture, it can cause large fish kills. Thermal pollution occurs when human activities cause a substantial change in the temperature of water. It usually comes from manufacturing or power plants that use the water for cooling and then they return it hot. Thermal shock occurs when a dramatic change in temperature kills many organisms adapted to a particular temperature range. Higher temperatures increase respiration rates, but if you remember from chemistry, it also decreases the solubility of oxygen in water, of any gas actually, but oxygen, obviously, organisms need to live. The EPA does regulate how much heated water can be released back into natural waterways. So some measures that businesses can take, they can pump water into ponds to cool them before they re-release it. They can use cooling towers to release excess heat through evaporation, or they can just reuse the water again at its warmer temperature. Noise pollution comes from sounds emitted by ships and submarines that interfere with animal communication. It is a major concern, especially loud sonar and large underwater air guns. Beached wells have been connected with these events. However, the U.S. Navy is exempt from environmental laws when it comes to building long-range sonar systems that go all the way across the ocean floor. Freshwater wetlands are aquatic biomes that are submerged or saturated by water for a part of or all of the year. Wetlands include swamps, marshes, bogs, prairie potholes, floodplains, and the Arctic tundra in summer. Swamps contain emergent trees, and marshes contain primarily non-woody vegetation such as sedges and grasses. Bogs are very acidic and typically contain sphagnum moss and spruce trees. Wetlands are among the most productive biomes on the planet and provide a variety of ecosystem services, including filtering pollutants from waters and replenishing stream flows and recharging aquifers with clean water, reducing flooding by taking large amounts of rainwater and slowly releasing it into the groundwater or streams. This reduces the severity of floods and droughts. They also help maintain biodiversity. A third of all endangered bird species in the U.S. spend some time in a wetland. They also supply valuable products and provide recreational opportunities. I included some pictures of plants and animals you would find in typical wetlands, including carnivorous plants that have evolved to get their nutrients from digesting animals due to the low nutrient content of the soil. Salt marshes are found along the coast in temperate climates and contain non-woody emergent vegetation, like I said, reeds, sedges, and grasses. Estuaries and coastal wetlands are subject to tidal rhythms, runoff from land, and seawater that mixes with fresh water and organic nutrients from rivers and streams. So they're very productive. The organisms here also have to be adapted to dealing with changes in salinity. Coastal wetlands or estuaries make nutrients available due to the constant stirring of the bottom sediments, so they tend to be very productive for plants and algae. These areas also filter toxic pollutants and excess plant nutrients. They help to reduce storm damage and provide nursery sites for aquatic species. 2/3 of marine fish and shellfish species spend their larval stages in estuaries. Mangrove swamps occur along tropical and subtropical coasts and contain submerged trees, although you can see their roots sticking out above the waterline in this picture. Mangrove trees are salt tolerant and help protect the coastline from erosion and storm damage. Falling leaves and trapped organic material make this a very nutrient-rich habitat. It also provides sheltered habitat for fish and shellfish. Coral reefs are found in warm, shallow waters beyond the shoreline. They are home to 1/4 of all marine species and are the most diverse marine biome. Now, corals are tiny cnidarians that secrete a calcium carbonate exoskeleton. Waters where corals live are relatively poor in nutrients and food, so corals contain an algae called zooxanthellae in their tissues that provide sugars through photosynthesis. And the zooxanthellae are also what gives them their color. This symbiotic relationship between corals and algae means that they must live in warm, shallow, sunlit waters. Corals live in vast colonies and leave their exoskeletons behind when they die, and this is what creates the massive reefs over time. Coral reefs are facing many challenges, including pollution, sediments, and coral bleaching. Coral bleaching occurs when the coral becomes stressed and it expels the zooxanthellae from its tissues. The coral then has no food source and it dies. What you're actually seeing is the calcium carbonate cup secreted by the coral. That's what's left behind. Scientists believe changing ocean pH and temperature combined with disease and environmental changes are causing the death of these algae and of coral reefs themselves. Synthetic organic compounds are carbon-containing compounds that include pesticides, pharmaceuticals, and industrial cleaners. Most do not target a particular species, but they're made to kill a wide variety of organisms. Pesticides alter physiological functions, and sometimes they can alter those that they weren't designed for, like DDT was designed to target nerve transmissions in insects, but made the eggshells thin on birds of prey. Inert ingredients are formulations that are legally classified as trade secrets, and their effects are not always known. Pharmaceuticals and hormones. U.S. waterways contain antibiotics, hormones, non-prescription drugs, steroids. There have been fish found with anti-anxiety medications in their tissues, male frogs with female eggs in their testes, just all kinds of unintended consequences of these pharmaceuticals and hormones in our waterways. Now, endocrine disruptors are chemicals that interfere with the normal functioning of hormones in an animal's body. Hormones are normally manufactured in the endocrine system and released into the bloodstream in very low concentrations, where they bind to specific cells and stimulate them to respond in a way that regulates the functioning of the body. Wastewater containing hormones from animal rearing facilities, birth control pills, and pesticides can mimic animal hormones. Like I said, male fish and frogs have been found with low sperm counts or eggs in their testes. Males normally convert estrogen into testosterone, but the endocrine disruptor binds to where the hormone normally should be, preventing the production of testosterone and the increasing levels of estrogen. It's also thought to cause low sperm counts in men and possibly breast cancer in women. And these are just some sources of chemicals that have been known to be endocrine disruptors in human beings. Some other synthetic organic compounds, military compounds, perchlorate is a really common one. It's used for rocket fuel. It tends to get into soil and groundwater in areas where military rockets are manufactured, tested, and dismantled. And as you can see, there's a nice red dot over Huntsville. Our exposure comes from either contaminated food that was irrigated with contaminated water or from drinking contaminated water. It can affect the thyroid gland and reduce hormone production. Industrial compounds. It used to be common practice for manufacturing plants to dump their waste directly into bodies of water. This is a picture of the Cuyahoga River in Ohio that feeds into Lake Erie that had been used as an industrial dump for over 100 years. It was pretty much dead. There was a slick of pollution that covered its surface, and the river caught fire 13 times, and the largest one being in 1952. The 1969 fire gained national attention and helped spur the creation of the EPA, the Clean Water Act, and the Great Lakes Water Act. Now, some industrial compounds, a real common one is PCBs, or polychlorinated biphenyls, and they were used in the manufacture of plastics and insulating electrical transformers. They're no longer manufactured in the U.S. They still persist in the environment. They are lethal and cancer-causing. The picture in the upper right-hand corner is a person afflicted with chloracne that came from being exposed to PCBs, or it can come from ingesting PCBs. GE dumped PCBs into the Hudson River for 3 decades, and in 2002 the EPA ruled that they must pay for the dredging and removal of 2 million cubic meters of contaminated sediment, but GE stalled, claiming dredging would only stir up those contaminated sediments, but they had to do it anyway in 2009. Other synthetic organic compounds, polybrominated diphenyl esters are flame retardants, used in everything from clothes to buildings. They can be detected in aquatic food chains, human breast milk. It can lead to brain damage, especially in children, and may interfere with sexual development and cause thyroid or liver cancer. The manufacture of several types of PBDEs have been banned by certain countries and states. Groundwater contamination in the U.S., the FDA reports of toxins found in many aquifers, gasoline, oil, nitrate ions from fertilizers, arsenic, which can be naturally occurring, and really prevention is key because it's too time-consuming and expensive to try to clean up an aquifer, and pretty much not going to be able, it's not going to work. So prevention is usually our only key in these cases because it takes hundreds or thousands of years for aquifers to replenish. So it would take that long for us to flush out or wait on the pollutants to naturally be flushed out of the groundwater. And biomagnification. We're exposed to toxins in many ways in the environment: air, the water we drink, bathe in, and swim in, the food we eat, where we live, work, or visit. And solubility is just how well a chemical can dissolve in a liquid, and the more soluble it is, the more easy it is for us to ingest it. Water-soluble chemicals can be pervasive in groundwater, they can be pervasive in surface waters. Oil-soluble chemicals tend to be stored in the fat tissues of animals. Bioaccumulation is an increased concentration of a chemical within an organism over time due to increased continued chemical exposure. Biomagnification, on the other hand, is the increase in chemical concentration in animal tissues as the chemical moves up the food chain. DDT is the classic example. By the time it makes its way up to birds of prey, the concentration can be nearly 8 million times higher than the concentration of DDT in the water. Some water laws. 1972 brought us the Clean Water Act, which was a very important act. It was originally called the Federal Water Pollution Control Act of 1948. It was expanded in 1972 when it was renamed. It supports the protection and propagation of fish, shellfish, and wildlife and recreation in and on water by maintaining, when necessary, restoring the chemical, physical, and biological properties of natural waters. It originally focused mostly on chemical properties of surface water. This does not include the protection of groundwater. That falls under a separate act. There's an increased focus on ensuring the abundance and diversity of species in our waterways, and issued water quality standards that define acceptable limits of various pollutants have been issued for waterways. The Safe Drinking Water Act of 1974 sets the national standards for safe drinking water. Now, it sets maximum containment levels with a limit that limits the amount of 77 different elements or substances that could be found in surface water or groundwater. Any waterways that are designated by their use, aesthetics, recreation, protection of fish, or source of safe drinking water fall under this act. And the EPA has determined that there has been a large improvement in bodies of water that support their designated uses. Now, a lot of people think drinking bottled water means it must be cleaner water, but actually some bottling companies just use local tap water. 40% of tested bottles of water came up with bacterial contamination, not to mention the fuel cost to manufacture the plastic bottles, the fuel cost in recycling of the plastic, and the fact that you could be charged up to 10,000 times the cost of tap water by buying a bottle of water. So there has been a growing back to the tap movement as people have been bringing their own water and using refillable water bottles. The Water Quality Act of 1987 requires states to identify waters that do not meet water quality standards due to the discharge of toxic substances, to adopt numerical criteria for the pollutants in such waters, and to establish effluent limitations for individual discharges to such water bodies. The EPA has determined there has been a large improvement, again, in bodies of water that support their designated uses under this act. This slide is just some things that we as individuals can do to reduce water pollution. Looking at legislation globally, developed countries have already gone through industrialization, have polluted their waterways, and are now addressing this problem on the back end. Developing countries are still industrializing, meaning they have less money and less strict environmental laws. Many contaminating industries will move to developing countries for these reasons. India's rivers have been reported to be grossly polluted due to discharge of untreated sewage disposal and industrial effluents directly into water. Whereas China's rivers, by 2020, they hope all cities will have their own small sewage treatment plants that will make wastewater clean enough to be recycled and put back into the urban water supply.